Can folks hear me okay? And maybe you could just start by typing in your chat that you can hear me okay. Or somebody can just say, hey, Tony, I hear you okay. Okay, good. Excellent.
Good, Tony.
Okay, great. Well, we're, okay, I do see that there are some individuals, okay, if you can hear me okay. I will say that delighted to welcome you to this really exciting webinar. I'm Anthony Bloom. I work as the Senior Education Technology Specialist at USAID, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome so many people. I think I had heard something like 300 people had signed up for this webinar, so it's really an outstanding demonstration of how many people are interested in this subject. We have a few housekeeping rules just to... Sorry, go ahead.
Is anyone talking?
Sorry, Ken.
Mine isn't, my sound isn't going.
Okay. I will say that please, just a few webinar housekeeping rules before we start, just to be respectful for everyone, is please mute your microphones to minimize background noise, and take advantage, of course, of the chat bar if you'd like us to have a question. You know, if you're having issues with the bandwidth, turn off your video. You can see this just in the housekeeping that are in front of you, so I don't need to read through all those as well. But we are recording this session, and then, of course, you could look for the presentation afterwards that will be posted on the INEE website. So as I mentioned, I'm Anthony Bloom. I work with USAID's education team as the Senior Education Technology Specialist. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce this webinar about the ICT Checklist for education in crisis and conflict settings. Education, crisis and conflict programming is a really important part of the USAID strategy, and in collaboration with a variety of institutions, including INEE and through our support contract with ECCN, we're thrilled to be able to bring this webinar to you. Clearly, this is a topic we know how many people are participating in this that is of deep interest. And how do we use ICT appropriately, scalably in a crisis and conflict setting has been a theme that's been discussed in a variety of previous webinars, including a number of those that the TECTT Task Team through INEE has been able to support. We are really excited that this webinar and this checklist is a byproduct of collaboration between INEE and ECCN, and the complementary relationship that we have between those entities. As we walk through the checklist, I hope that you'll realize that it's a checklist that could be used, of course, to help program in our crisis and conflict settings, but also beyond just a crisis and conflict settings. What we're additionally really excited by the checklist is it just is good programming to be able to use a checklist like this of your interventions, regardless whether it's in a crisis and conflict setting or not. We also hope that, and really the purpose of this webinar and introduction, and so many of you participating, is that you'll help us in being able to pilot test the checklist and provide us your feedback. That's obviously, we don't want this to be a tool that's underutilized, and as exciting as it is for us to work in collaboration to be able to develop this, we are quite interested in having feedback as well. I will say that one of the authors of the checklist is joining us today, and I'll do a brief introduction in just a moment, and that's Simon Richmond. But unfortunately, Lisa Hartenberg-Toby, the other author, was unable to join us today. And so you may have seen on the agenda that this opening was going to be from Lisa, and it's from me instead. So what I'd really like to do is then provide just a brief introduction to the speakers that will be participating in today's webinar. We're delighted that Jim Rogan, a senior advisor to USAID's Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, ECCN, and principal owner of Exterion LLC, an international development consulting firm, is joining us. Jim has a long experience in terms of peace building and governance issues, and has held senior management positions in a variety of organizations, including the UN and private sector. So Jim, I know I'll be turning it over to you in a moment after the other introduction, but thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We're also delighted that Mona Yunus is joining us as well. And in addition to being the TECTT Task Team co-convener, welcome Mona, obviously long history in terms of working in the field of education and emergencies, and you've provided a variety of consultancies to institutions such as UNHCR, World Child Hall, and Plan International, particularly focused in the MENA region. And then last but not least, I'd like, as I had mentioned, to introduce one of the co-authors of this paper, with whom I've had good pleasure to work over a number of years because of his leadership in terms of ICT and education, is Simon Richmond. And he's the team leader on ICT at Education Development Center, where he manages the design and implementation of a variety of technology-based interventions for international development, and it provides support, deep technical support in a variety of educational settings, including in crisis and conflict in Africa and Asia. So without further ado, so we can get to the substance of the checklist and hear from our specialists, I'd like to turn it over to Jim to start the discussion, and encourage you, of course, to make sure that you're using the web chat, again, to be able to keep track and send us your questions so we can make this discussion as participatory as possible. Thanks so much, and turning it over to you, Jim.
Thanks very much, Tony. I hope everyone can hear me. I'll try to be brief because we thought that it might be a good idea to just go over the backdrop to conflict sensitivity and just refresh our understanding of what it really means. I know we have a lot of conflict specialists here on the call, and we're grateful for that. I'm just going to go over some of the basics to just set the stage a little bit. So I like to go back to the Do No Harm project of the 1990s. Some of you may know of Mary B. Anderson and CDA Collaborative Project. They came up with, I think, what was a crystallizing moment, and took away 6 lessons from their review of global efforts in conflict, understanding conflict and the interaction between international aid and conflict settings. And I don't want to read each of those lessons you see on the slide. I'll try to enhance them. The first one is basically that any intervention becomes part of its context, and that means that there's no neutrality. No intervention is neutral in the eyes of people in that context. The second is that all contexts can be characterized by what we call dividers and connectors. You conflict specialists out there, you know what I'm talking about, but we can analyze a context in terms of dividers and connectors, or the factors which either fuel social division and tension or violent conflict, or those that foster cohesion and collaboration. All interventions, therefore, either make them worse or make them better. They interact with both of them. The ABC's finding for me is an important one. Actions and behaviors have consequences. All interventions consist of actions and behaviors, and those actions can reflect the effects of resources being brought into the context. Behavior reflects the conduct of the people involved with the intervention or the resource. And the details matter. The details of the intervention matter because those are the details where the impacts come from, not necessarily the whole big intervention itself. And the more we can understand those details, the more we can understand how actions and behaviors interact with the context. And lastly, there are always options, and these options emerge from our understanding of the actions and behaviors. Let me see if I can operate the next slide. Now, here's the definition that I've broken out into 3 components. Again, most of you probably are very familiar with this. Hopefully this has become, part of your DNA, and I'll just speak to these 3 and enhance them again. Under the first, understanding the conflict context where the intervention takes place, or as the case may be, education. We cannot understand conflict through a normal situation analysis or education assessment. To understand conflict, we need to use conflict analysis. And in general, that means that we are looking at investigating the profile, causes, grievances, actors, and dynamics, which may include those dividers and connectors we just mentioned, of a conflict. And a conflict analysis can be done as a standalone activity. It can be done as an integrated effort in an education sector assessment or a situation analysis. A couple of examples are USAID's own conflict assessment framework, which is quite good. That can be an example of a standalone, or USAID's new rapid education and risk analysis tool, which we developed under the ECCN project, that integrates conflict analysis and other contextual risk analyses with an education sector assessment. Now, We can understand and explore how education, the role education has played in a conflict by looking at whether it's exacerbating those factors that drive conflict or whether they are, it is helping strengthen those sources of collaboration and cohesion. And much of it always centers on how we are managing, or how the host country, the education system, is managing diversity. Is the education system discriminatory? Is its delivery systems, is it promoting inequitable access by certain identity groups and regions? How is the curriculum teaching history and politics? What is the language of instruction where there might be minority languages prevalent throughout the country, and so forth? Conversely, education can mitigate those conflict factors by promoting inclusion, becoming equitably accessible, being more non-discriminatory, and so forth. When we look at the two-way interaction between the conflict context and the intervention, here we're looking more specifically at our intervention, and this in a way looks at the utility of the checklist that we'll be discussing today. And I don't want to start jumping ahead, but some of the questions that you want to look at are: who benefits from, who accesses the services or resources offered by the intervention? To which identity group do they belong? Who benefits, who does not? How does the intervention affect conflict dividers, power dynamics? Who is involved in managing the intervention? How is it perceived? How are all the staff perceived? And so forth. Lastly, I would stress too that the role of participation is important. So has there been any participation and a diversity of input from stakeholders, from communities, from identity groups in all phases of the intervention itself? The last component of the definition, acting to minimize the education intervention's negative impacts and positive impacts, I think it's useful to look at this, at how the intervention can build in flexibility and adaptability, specifically informed by its understanding of conflict and its relationship with those dividers and connectors. So for instance, how does the intervention use feedback loops to obtain data on its interaction with that context? Are there mechanisms for decision makers to act on those feedback loops, on both dividers and connectors, and looking at all elements of that intervention, from staffing, targeting and beneficiaries, operations and management, communications, even down to partnerships and procurement. So the entire identity of that intervention, actions and behaviors is important. And I'd also stress that here, under the ACT dimension of the conflict sensitivity definition, we begin to see the connectivity between conflict sensitivity and USAID's collaborating, learning, and adapting approach, or CLA, and adaptive management. Now, on slide 3, these are just some of the more salient sort of lenses, considerations that we used when we were pulling together the checklist. I've touched on the first one, pretty much already. We wanted to make sure that we investigated how the intervention, the ICT intervention, would touch upon dividers, grievances, inequalities, and we also wanted to make sure that we asked the necessary questions that relate to identity groups, because identity groups are, simply put, groups to which people affiliate, feel loyalty to, and share a common identity, such as on the basis of ethnic, religious, or political beliefs. And they're often key actors to a conflict. So making sure that this checklist had a strong lens on the relationship of the intervention with identity groups as well was very important. Participation, as I mentioned, is crucial, especially when it comes from a diversity of stakeholders in the planning and implementation of the intervention. Communities typically know best the prevailing sensitivities, grievances, and other factors that can fuel division, and also what are those factors that might be fostering collaboration and cohesion. So the closer we can get to communities and having those open channels of communication and feedback loops, that's extremely useful for conflict sensitivity. Lastly, we wanted to make sure that we looked at all phases of the ICT intervention. I've touched on this already. The whole identity and all the actions of that intervention, from soup to nuts, as our dear Director Cornelia would say, is all relevant for conflict sensitivity. So we wanted to look at all phases of the ICT intervention. So that's a quick run through, hopefully a useful refresher. I'm going to now hand over to Mona, and she is going to take the ball from there.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Jim, so much for setting the scene. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and the framing of the checklist and how did it came about, how has it been developed. Now, the checklist for information and communication technologies interventions to support education crisis and conflict settings is actually the result of a collaborative effort that took place within more than a year between ECCN, which is the Education Crisis and Conflict Network, and the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. The two entities worked together in a very iterative, very professional fashion for over a year in order to find a solution. They both identified that there is a need to find out a tool or a solution in the area of conflict sensitivity for ICT-supported education interventions. We all could see that there is a boom of ICT-supported education interventions, especially in crisis settings. However, what was needed is some guidelines, some help, some tool, some kind of a tool that would help those practitioners on the ground who are promoting or who are implementing those ICT-supported education interventions in order to do that in a highly conflict-sensitive manner. Now, the next slide I'm talking about here is the reference group. This collaborative relationship between ECCN and INEE TECTT Task Team, which is the Technology and Education in Crisis Task Team, actually resulted into a reference group. That reference group was very clear that it had an aim, and the aim was to develop a solution that is useful for practitioners working on the ground in order to be very conflict sensitive when they implement an ICT supported educational intervention. This reference group actually came with a lot of rich and very rich expertise coming from USAID, ECCN, UNICEF, Creative Associates, INEE TECHT Task Team, and Concern worldwide. All of those members of the reference group worked together, contributed to the development of that solution. The relationship was very collaborative, constructive, iterative, professional relationship, and each one of the members actually brought a new perspective to the discussion table. Now, next to that, we wanted to tell you, giving you a background or a sense what is that checklist we are talking about. Now, we have two big intersecting areas or fields. One is the field of program design for conflict settings, and the other area is program design for technology use. And between those two areas, there is an intersection in between. And what we wanted to find out is how can we actually help people who are working in that intersecting area, in this space that is in the intersection between the two areas, because they have very specific issues that require particular thought and particular attention, and which could otherwise be overlooked. Which means that this checklist is not a complete guide to design ICT interventions. It is not a guide to design education interventions for conflict or crisis settings. It is not a standalone solution, but it is actually a companion tool which can be used with other tools that are coming from the two other areas in order to provide a comprehensive investigation of conflict sensitivity or the ICT design. Which means that what we were thinking about is we were very clear from the very start and from day one. We do not want to duplicate any kind of effort that has been done before. We are completely aware that there are tools that deal with conflict-sensitive design of educational interventions. We are completely aware that there is a long list of tools and guidelines for those who are using ICT in education. But what we were also aware of is that there is a crack in between those two areas, and there are issues that fall in that crack, and that we want to deal with those issues that fall in that crack and that are usually and sometimes actually overlooked. Now, we said this is a companion tool, and therefore, because it is a companion tool and because we are very much aware that there are other tools that are very useful, we recommend the use of this checklist as part of a suite of tools. And those tools that we are talking about, these are a couple of examples of them: the Principles for Digital Development, reflection tool for designing and implementing conflict-sensitive education programs, the INEE Conflict-Sensitive Education Pack, rapid education risk analysis, technology for evaluation in fragile and conflict-affected states. These are a couple of tools that should actually be used, and the checklist we are talking about today is a companion tool that should be used alongside those other tools. Now, the other question and the main question that we have to think about is the why and when. Why actually did the reference group format this tool in the form of a checklist? Why hasn't it been a training pack, a guideline, principles, standards, minimum standards? No, we did not think of having something in those other forms. We were very clear we wanted a checklist that is abbreviated, that is allowing time for designers to still use the other tools in the broader conflict sensitivity area and in the broader areas of ICT design. We wanted something that is really useful, user-friendly, and that is very much focused, highlighting the critical issues that need particular attention. We wanted something that is really, really very applicable, very practical, useful for practitioners who are implementing very serious educational programs on the ground using ICT-supported tools. Now, why should this checklist be used? Now, when should this checklist be used? This checklist should actually be used at the start of any kind of intervention, and that's very important because this checklist is actually talking about the different phases, and we wanted to ensure that people and practitioners on the ground are thinking about all the issues up front and then repeatedly being used again and again throughout the intervention, throughout the different phases, in order to check that the principles are checked as the issues arise, and in order to be able to answer the questions that are in the checklist and to reflect back on the actions that have been taken. Now I'm going to hand over to Simon, who is going to go through the checklist and give you a much clearer picture of how does it look like. Thank you. To you, Simon.
Everyone can hear me, please chat something in the box if my mic isn't working. So far, of course, we've heard from Jim, and we've gotten a little crash course on what conflict sensitivity is all about. And thank you to Mona as well for giving us an overview of the ecosystem of tools that this checklist exists in, and for walking us through how to use it and how we tried to keep the focus of this checklist tight. What I'm going to cover right now is a couple things. I'm going to go through the layout of the instrument. That's number one. Number two, I'll walk you through how we've organized it for hopefully for easy use. And then number three, make a couple recommendations about how you can use it. And hopefully, if there's time, close with number four, a review of some of the content. So let's look right now at the layout, number one. This is the whole instrument right here. It's 16 pages long, from cover to references. And we'll go into it in a little bit. But you'll notice right away that the heart of the instrument here, right across the middle of this layout, alternates between a page of questions on the left and then a blank page on the right. This blank page is for your notes as you use the instrument. So what that means is that although the whole document is 16 pages, you'll notice that the heart of it is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 pages of questions right here. Now, we laid this out in the following sections. So using the same graphic, let's just look how it's organized. With the cover on the left, we spend the first 3 pages going over an introduction to some of these ideas that Mona has touched on and recommendations on tool use. And then the heart is divided across 5 different phases of a project life. Of course, we close with references at the end. So these 5 phases are fairly standard. Begin with an analysis of the situation, that's phase 1, then you move to your design and plan, phase 2, and then your implementation, 3, your M&E, which of course is ongoing throughout the life of your project from beginning to end, but it helps to pull it out as its own phase, and then of course phase 5, closeout. So the checklist has different sets of questions that we hope people are paying attention to in each of these different phases. And that's why we've set up a separate question sheet for each of them. Now, I suppose let me jump forward to another component of the organization. And we call these the 4 C's. Down on the right, you see community, content, communication device, and connection. Now, Jim mentioned at the top of this whole webinar the importance of keeping a focus on the details. And so that's a good introduction to how we approached ICT in general. As we were designing our questions, we tried to have a holistic view of how ICT is used. And that means understanding its implications for the community of users around it. And we see that in this picture here. This is the cover shot from our sheet, our cover. It's not just the little boy in orange stripes who's using the devices. It's companions who are watching him use it. And of course, there's all kinds of other people who aren't even in this picture who comprise the community around these children. So all of these people are impacted, whether they're using the device or not. And so we have to keep track of those kinds of details. And therefore, a lot of our questions focus on the community. That's the first of the 4 C's. Content is fairly obvious. That's what's on the device. And then the device itself, that's the 3rd C. Managing the hardware, keeping it secure. How do people understand how to use it? Those kinds of questions. And then, of course, the connection itself, assuming there is one. Many good interventions run offline, but if there is a connection, there's often good questions that come from checking how people have access to that connection and how secure it is, those kinds of things. So these 4 C's provide a matrix that crossed with the 5 stages in a project's lifestyle help us organize all of the questions. And this means that across the top, the kind of horizontal axis, if you will, you have the 5 stages of the project. And then within each one, you have questions organized around all 4 of these C's. Sometimes more than one question, sometimes a single question for each C. So it kind of gives us a matrix structure as you go through the checklist. Now, a couple of words about usage. This tool is made to cover, hopefully, any kind of ICT intervention that you may be working with. So that means it's very broad. When you are using it, you might find that we've tried to word the questions as generally as possible so that they're applicable to a number of different tools and contexts. My advice would be deconstruct the question. If you come across a question that doesn't quite seem to make sense for your situation, try and deconstruct it and get to the heart of what it's trying to ask and think through how it can be tweaked to apply to your context. Because there is a lot of underlying thinking that Jim and Mona have sped through, and it might not appear that each question is relevant, but the principles at play may still make sense. So try and get beyond what the question is asking and see if it can't be modified slightly. Secondly, obviously this is a checklist for people's own benefits. Hopefully people will give it proper consideration and honest thought. It's the kind of thing which is meant to guide you towards an ideal principle of practice. And that means that all of the questions are set up for a yes-no answer. And hopefully if you get a yes answer, then you're on the right track. If you get a no answer, it may be worth going back to your design setup and thinking through how you can tweak things a bit to get towards yes. We've kept the notes page there for people to fill out as they go along for both yes and no answers. If it's yes, then you probably want to write out your explanation anyway, just for the sake of institutional memory, and so you have a record of things in case you need to check back on them several years in the future. And if it's no, and you are trying to keep track of why it's no, this is a good place to document what the issues are and elaborate on how you might be able to make changes to get towards yes. Okay, so far that's the overview of the instrument and its layout and a little bit of advice on how to use it. We still have enough time to go into some of the sample questions. So let's do that now. I'm not going to go question by question because that would take a little bit too long. But I thought it might be helpful just to kind of rhetorically read a couple of questions and let's pull out from each of the different C categories 1 or 2 questions across all 5 phases of the project. So on this screen here, we have phase 1, an ICT conflict analysis. And these first 2 questions here, I'm not sure if you can read them on the screen. If not, I hope you're able to follow the links in the chat that will help you download the instrument. But the first one just asks, has a specific conflict analysis been conducted as part of your broader ICT and education situation analysis? Very simple question. And then number 2, right below that, does the analysis include information on the role of ICT in the conflict and how it may be used by different dividers and connectors in the community? So again, this is hopefully something that's already been done. And if it hasn't been done and you stop and use the checklist while you're in this conflict analysis stage, it can serve as a reminder to go back and make sure ICT is a specific part of your conflict analysis. So a sample question from the first phase. Let me move over to the right side of the screen, the second phase. This is design and planning. I'm going to scroll down a little bit to the second C, which is content. The top question here, is the content and modes of interaction promoted by ICT culturally appropriate and equitably accessible to all? Sometimes when you are designing some educational intervention, there's a lot of content that you're covering in the curriculum, and there's a lot of pedagogical decisions that you're making about how you're teaching that content, and all of those things are being programmed into the ICT itself. So it's worth attending to those kinds of issues to make sure that what you're expecting people to learn and how you're expecting them to learn it, which this device is driving or measuring or however the device is being used, that is not only culturally appropriate, but it's also equitably accessible. Another content-related question is just below that. Is the content producer perceived as neutral to the conflict? Is it unlikely that this will change during or after the life of the intervention? I recall a specific project in a conflict region where the U.S. government was trying to fund a news source that was fair and objective and open to all. And it was very important that this news source was neutral. So a great deal of effort was made by USAID to give it full independence and autonomy. And then there was further thought given to whether or not USAID branding regulations should be applied if they were going to have spent so much time also making sure that the audience for the news knew that it was neutral. So in the end, USAID waived the branding requirements for this project. And that's a good example of understanding that you want the content to be perceived as neutral, and you should go to great lengths to be able to ensure that neutrality if at all possible. I'm going to jump a little further into the instrument. This is now phase 3 on the left here. Let's move down to the 4th C. These are questions related to the actual devices, communication devices. The first one here in this example is, do all targeted educational groups have equitable and adequate access to device maintenance and or replacement? And then just below that, is the distribution of devices perceived as fair and equitable by all targeted educational group beneficiaries? So who's using the hardware? Does everyone have equitable access to it? And do they all have access to replacing or to maintenance for it? Who is providing that tech support? Are those individuals part of the same identity groups as the users of those devices? All kinds of detailed questions that we're hoping people are able to flag with a checklist like this. Jumping one more phase over to the 4th phase, monitoring and evaluation, of course, an ongoing phase. I'm going to just pull on this question down here, the last of the 4 C's. Is the M&E data collected on digital devices secure enough to protect data from being used to exacerbate conflict or put individuals or groups at risk? Obviously, data security is important in any project, but in a conflict setting, it's particularly sensitive. And so you want to make sure that the data that you might be collecting as part of M&E and which is being transferred perhaps over a wireless connection is encrypted and secure in those regards. Lastly, I don't have phase 5 on the screen here, but just a sample question from closeout, rotating back to the top question, the top C category. One of the questions here asks, has any potential harm to beneficiaries due to the withdrawal of ICT devices and content at closeout been considered and mitigated? What happens when you're done and you get your devices back, or you close out the services that they're providing? Are you considering what potential harm might possibly happen to your beneficiaries? So a good question about thinking beyond the life of your project. So that's a very quick overview of all the types of questions that this checklist gets at. And I think this is the right time to pause and welcome questions from you guys. These can be questions to any of the presenters so far. And if you want to type them into your chat box, we will try and address them between us. So let me give you a few seconds of thinking time and see what kind of questions you might have. one question that's come in so far. Somebody is asking if we have evidence of ICT for EICC contributing to the division of conflict to foster greater social cohesion. Anyone on the panel have an answer to that question? Feel free to jump in if you have concrete evidence. I know that data on all kinds of different interventions is always welcome. We certainly hear lots of anecdotes, and I can share some of those.
This is Jim. I similarly don't have evidence of cases in the past. I think that's where you're going, Ash. Hopefully that is still intuitively clear enough that the risk is there that these kinds of interventions could do so, but in terms of evidence, I don't have any right now available.
I heard a story recently from a radio education project that was running in Somalia. And this was a project that was broadcasting primary school curriculum to learners who were out of school because of the situation. And part of the programming, although it covered the regular curriculum of math and literacy and those types of subjects, part of the curriculum was woven around storylines that involved conflict resolution. And young children were not only covering, the regular subjects, but were learning how to resolve their conflicts through listening to the plot lines and the radio characters that they were listening to every day. So this project continued to stay on air and was listened to widely. I think largely because of the values the communities were placing around education, but also because the conflict resolution messages were embedded in such a way that they were subtle and they were not being, audience didn't feel like they were being hit over the head. When we did focus group discussions, the person telling the story explained that they learned from a lot of communities that when they heard more direct conflict resolution programming on the radio, they just automatically turned it off as they feared that it was, propaganda. But it didn't seem to mind when the storylines in the radio show for their children were addressing the same issues when they were tied to educational objectives. I'm sure we all have stories like that. But it's always difficult to get evidence in an objective sense. So there's a lot of questions coming in the chat right now, more than I'm able to speed read and think of answers to. Is there anyone else, Jim and Mona, who are seeing questions come up there that you want to try and take on?
This is Jim. Let me see if I can put on my screen again. I appreciate the point here. We had David mentioning the role of special needs. Perhaps this could be something that we could enhance looking ahead at, after some field implementation. And Ash's question is a very important one, and I think I am not recalling where there has been evidence of, strictly speaking, ICT interventions for education. I can think of many radio programs that had a role in promoting a conflict. And many of us can recall back to the mid-1990s, Rwanda, for instance, but I'm reluctant to characterize that as education. So very good question, which maybe we should keep with us as we close the webinar. Let's see here. Mona, jump in as well. I'm going through the list of questions.
What happens when your checklist results in one or two no responses that can't be quickly addressed, such as pre-packed curriculum in the software? Should the ICT approach be dropped entirely in that case? Again, it has to do with the context. a decision like that has to be done by actually analyzing the whole context and see the pros and the cons of dropping the entire case. But if the checklist is used very wisely from the very start and before actually implementing the program itself, it will help very much that those cases don't arise. This is the whole sense of it, that people are aware that there are issues that might arise that would trigger more conflict or more conflict and more issues, and therefore using it upfront is really very much recommended. And I think that those cases, yes, sometimes it happens, but decisions like that has to be actually very context specific, and the checklist helps to be to take those decisions in an informed way.
And I would only add to what Mona said about the yes/no, the binary category that we have there. You know, look at options. I think that it doesn't necessarily mean, in this case you brought up, that you have to drop the whole intervention. I think what you need to do, as if you're the management team, you need to get as much information as you can about the intervention, about your options. And remember, we talked about options early on in a very general sense. I think you need to use that information, and then as a management team, you need to consider what your options are. But I think, like Mona was saying, what you don't want to do is do something that is going to worsen those conflict dynamics and put people at risk. So you have to inform yourselves as much as possible about options.
I see another question here that's observing that when you start out the project with the best of intentions, you may keep the focus on technical issues, but very often there are such polarizing issues among the community that are involved in the technical discussion that the chat on WhatsApp or whatever platform you're using quickly becomes so full of political content that technical issues fall by the wayside. Obviously, that's a common and a very human kind of phenomenon. People want to talk about the issues that they have grievances with on whatever platform they may find themselves, even when it's not appropriate. And due to the sensitivity and the importance of neutrality, my advice in a situation like that is going to be to try and give people the alternative platforms for them to have their own discussions, but carefully monitor the platforms that you're using for your own technical discussions to keep them as neutral as possible. So if you do have a WhatsApp group and people are supposed to be talking about a technical issue, they all have access to everybody else's phone numbers on that list, so they can set up their own side discussion among themselves on their own issues. But of course, try and keep your own project WhatsApp group as neutral as possible. It's very difficult to separate the different forums on the same platform, but it's important to try and do that.
And back to the use of the checklist and doing this at the earliest stages, again, as a management decision, you need to round out those scenarios as much as possible to see what those options might be. And I think as checklists go, this may not prompt every single possible scenario, but the more you can think ahead about what these very highly politically charged situations can produce and how they can interact with your technology, think about, again, those options for what you can do. And this is something that we're seeing in the United States.
There is another question. Is this checklist applicable to all educational services, formal, non-formal, across educational levels? Yes, it was actually developed in a very generic format and with very generic wording so that it can be applicable for those different types of educational interventions and across the different educational levels as well. Could you clarify how digital literacy comes into the ICT checklist? There are a couple of questions that were related to digital literacy and to the skill level of those who are actually targeted by the ICT supported intervention. It did not go very much into the in-depth and the nuances of digital literacy, but it tackled those issues that might actually trigger conflict if they are not taken care of from the very start, especially skill level, knowledge level of the different targeted groups.
I don't want to jump ahead. I admit it's challenging to pick up all the very good questions. The continuation here from, I think it's Tawfiq here, about whether in the case of the WhatsApp platform, if the admin, the owner, the person seen as running that app is from one identity group, I think right there is a consideration for conflict sensitivity that, again, you need to ask yourselves as the owners, the managers of that intervention, what's the right thing? I think in a politically charged environment, if you know going in that you are going to be seen as representing, rightly or wrongly, one of the identity groups, one of the parties, you need to work that out. You need to take some measures to mitigate that the risk that you're going to be seen as being biased toward one of the groups. So back to this reflective tool before you get going, think about the options you can take to mitigate that risk.
When you're choosing the administrators for your WhatsApp groups, for example, you want to have a cross-section of them and make sure that there's representation from all identity groups among those who are administrating, so that the same identity group member who is barring somebody from the chat is selected from among those available. That probably doesn't sound very clear, but I hope you get where I'm going with that. The point is that the checklist has reminders about these kinds of issues when you're doing your layout and you're planning your staffing, so that you can be prepared to arise, hopefully.
Yeah, and I also suggest too, back to the notion of participation and diversity of input. Let's run with this a bit longer. You do your checklist, you see the situation as a risk. Not being beholden to financial resource limitations. If you're able to run some focus group discussions or reach out to other stakeholders, ask around and see what would be acceptable before you launch your app. Talk to various people from the different identity groups quietly and in whatever manner might be appropriate, but get that diversity of input into your planning, and you might get some creative ideas. But there you're doing a very good due diligence in a conflict setting to try to reach out and sound out the various stakeholders of what could work.
Now we're coming to the top of the hour here, so we're not going to have much more time, but Mona, it looked like you were about to add on to that.
Yes, I just wanted to add that while we were developing the checklist, we had the 4A scheme in our mind, that any kind of intervention, especially ICT-based or supported interventions, have to be acceptable, accessible, adaptable, and available. And here, in the case that someone was raising, it seems that the principle of acceptability was not very much catered to, but therefore, although we have written the whole checklist with the 4 C's very clearly outlined, but in our mind, we also we're very much aware that any kind has to be acceptable by the whole community. It has to be accessible by all the different identity groups. It has to be adaptable to the context and available to the different target groups in different timings and in the setting that it should be. I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I see a question here asking about, has this instrument been piloted? And that's a great segue into the final comments. But one more question, is this checklist available as an app? Great question. At this point, it's only available on paper. But if anyone has got the bandwidth to make an app, I'm sure that would be very much welcome by the rest of the group. Regarding piloting, the same invitation applies. We are looking for projects in a number of different contexts to pilot this instrument and to contribute their findings back into a next draft. So I want to close by opening this up to anyone who would like to contact me. And if you do have a project that would make good use of this instrument, please go ahead and use it. It's open and free to use for everybody. But send me an email about how that's gone for you and what kind of recommendations you might make to changing it so that we can try and iterate an improved draft for future project generations. That said, any other closing points? I want to leave this open to my co-presenters if there's any other final thoughts that they would like to share.
This is Jim. I was about to write this, but I'll say it. You know, this checklist has been really oriented toward the startup of the intervention, but you know, let's not forget how vital it is to do this kind of reflection throughout the cycle of an intervention. You do want to do this check-in. You want to have this, you know, help your feedback loops throughout all phases of your intervention. So this has a broader utility, not just at startup.
Yeah, good point, Jim. A broad utility other than startup and designed for uses across many different types of education project. So we try to keep it as general as possible. I've put my email address up there on the screen if you would like to reach out with suggestions or your own experiences using this in a pilot setting. And that said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and welcome you to use this checklist as you see fit. So thanks very much, and hope you have a good day wherever you are.
Yes, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you too.